The US war against Iran continues to escalate. After the Donald Trump administration unilaterally launched this war against Iran at the end of February, it was widely reported that it caused the largest oil supply disruption in history. However, in mid-June, the US and Iranian governments signed a memorandum of understanding, and it seemed like the war was over. And it was widely acknowledged in the Western media that the US lost this war, that Iran won. However, the US government constantly violates the agreements that it makes with other countries. And just 1 month after Trump signed that memorandum of understanding, he unilaterally withdrew, killing the deal. And on the 14th of July, the US military imposed a blockade of Iran to try to prevent Iran from exporting oil. This is why Iran responded to this US act of aggression by closing down the Strait of Hormuz, which is the most important oil transit choke point on Earth. Before the US started this war, about 20% of the globally traded oil supply passed through this narrow strait on a daily basis. In response to the US war, Iran closed it down. However, that's not all. There has also been another major development in this war that demonstrates how the war is expanding and becoming a regional conflict. And the latest news is that Yemen has now joined in this war, and the political authorities that govern the northern part of Yemen, known as the Houthi movement, or their real name is Ansar Allah, they are politically allied with Iran, and Yemen announced that it is imposing a maritime blockade of Saudi Arabia. And by the way, I should point out that Yemen did not do this just simply for fun or out of spite. Yemen did this in response to Saudi attacks that were backed by the US government. In fact, the US media outlet Axios reported that Trump personally gave the green light to the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and the US essentially pushed Saudi Arabia to attack Yemen in order to expand this war because the northern part of Yemen, where the majority of the population lives, governed by Ansar Allah, is politically allied with Iran. So Trump expanded this war, and Yemen retaliated by shutting down a lot of the oil traffic in the Red Sea. And the so-called Houthis, again, the real name is Ansar Allah, and they announced that any oil tankers that use Saudi ports will be attacked. And many analysts are warning that this closure of the Red Sea, in addition to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, could cause yet another major oil crisis. Oil prices are already skyrocketing, and as energy prices rise, this will lead to higher rates of inflation because energy, oil, and other byproducts of oil are needed to transport goods throughout the economy. So what we're now seeing is that 2 of the most important oil transit choke points on Earth have been shut down. This includes the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. Now, on average, on a daily basis, a little over 100 million barrels of oil are produced every day. Approximately 1/5 of that, a little over 20%, passes through the Strait of Hormuz. At least it did before the US started this war of aggression. And a bit over 8 million passed through the Bab al-Mandeb, which is another oil transit choke point going into the Red Sea. So we're now talking about roughly 30% of the global oil supply being disrupted in these 2 major trade choke points. I have a map here showing these geostrategic choke points, and you can see that the Bab al-Mandeb connects the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Yemen, going into the Red Sea off the coast of Saudi Arabia, and then tankers can also travel north through the Suez Canal, which is another very important geostrategic choke point. And roughly 9 million barrels of oil per day pass through the Suez Canal. Thus far, the Suez has not been directly impacted by the US war against Iran and the other conflicts that have now spread in the region. But if the Suez is also impacted, we could be talking about nearly 40% of the global oil supply being disrupted because of this war that continues to expand. Although, to be fair, these disruptions don't mean that suddenly 20 million to 30 million barrels of oil disappear, because what previously happened is after Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia redirected some of its oil exports to its western coast, because Saudi Arabia previously had been exporting a lot of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, but Saudi Arabia has a large pipeline going from the east to the western coast. It's called the East-West Pipeline, and that goes to the western city of Yanbu, which is a major port city in Saudi Arabia. And Yemen has now said that it's going to attack any tankers that use the ports in Yanbu, this important port city in Saudi Arabia. So one of the reasons that this previous phase of the US war against Iran didn't cause a complete meltdown in the global oil market is, one, because China actually, by the way, significantly reduced its oil imports. China was able to do that largely because it has massive reserves of its own, and because China has invested in huge expansion and build out of solar, wind, and nuclear energy, and because in China, in major cities, many people are now using electric vehicles, so they don't need gasoline. But in addition to the China factor, another reason that the disruptions in the global oil market weren't as extreme as people had warned at first is because not all of Saudi Arabia's oil exports were taken offline, because Saudi Arabia was able to redirect that oil through the East-West pipeline to the Red Sea. However, with the Yemeni blockade of Saudi Arabia, that is no longer an option. So we're going to see significant disruption in the oil market. This is why the price of a barrel of crude oil has shot up to nearly $100. Now, in late June and early July, after the US and Iran signed the Memorandum of Understanding, and it looked like the war may end before Trump violated that deal, the price of oil had fallen to just around $70 per barrel. So we've seen a massive increase just in a few days. Now, to be fair, we haven't seen the previous peak of prices, which were more than $110, but it's quite possible that the price of crude will continue to rise as the US escalates, as Saudi Arabia attacks Yemen following Trump's orders, and as Yemen retaliates by shutting down the Red Sea and imposing this blockade of the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. And of course, Iran continues to target ships that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And we're also seeing this reflected in the price of gasoline in the United States, which shot up. Now, previously, after the US and Iran signed the deal, in late June, the price of gasoline in the US did fall, although it did not fall to the same level that it was at before the US started this war. And this is because even if the war stopped tomorrow magically, there would still be significant disruptions in the oil industry. And of course, gasoline is a byproduct. You need crude oil to process it in order to make gasoline. And the price of gasoline has continued to skyrocket. And I should point out that this comes just a few months before midterm elections are going to be held in the US in November. And Trump is already extremely unpopular. At least 60% of Americans are opposed to Trump. And as gasoline prices continue to rise, his approval rating is going to fall even more, because when the price of gasoline rises, it causes inflation in the rest of the economy. And the US is a country that has very bad public transportation. You pretty much have to drive everywhere unless you live in New York City, which most Americans don't. They live in places where they have to drive. So when the price of gasoline rises, this really hurts them. And by the way, it's quite possible that this oil crisis could get even worse, because thus far, Yemen has imposed a blockade of Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea, but Yemen has not directly attacked Saudi oil facilities. But Yemen has said that this is one of the options that they're considering. And of course, Saudi Arabia plays an absolutely indispensable role in the global oil industry. Saudi Arabia is the second largest oil producer on earth. The United States is actually the biggest oil producer, but the US has still been heavily impacted because the price of oil is global. So even though the US does produce a lot of oil domestically, Americans have not benefited from low oil prices and low gasoline prices because oil is a globally traded commodity. The price of a barrel of crude is pretty much the same everywhere. There are differences in benchmarks depending on the region. But the point is that the more disruption we see in the global oil industry due to this war in West Asia and the so-called Middle East, the more disruption we see, the higher oil prices will rise and the more we'll see inflation and potentially economic crisis. In fact, Donald Trump himself warned in mid-June that countries only had 4 weeks left of oil in their reserves. And this was when it was assumed that the war was going to end. However, obviously the war did not end. Trump resumed it. The US is escalating it. It continues to expand across the region. And if you look at the official US government data on the US SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, you can see every week it reports that the number of barrels of crude oil in the USPR is falling. It's at the lowest level now in more than 4 decades. So this is why if you read US financial media outlets like Bloomberg, you will see that they are very much afraid of the crisis that this could cause in the global oil industry. So now that I've established all of that and talked about the impact on the oil market, I want to continue this analysis by explaining more about the situation in Yemen, because this often confuses people. They say, who are the Houthis? What is the real Yemeni government? What's going on? Well, here I have a map showing which parts of Yemen are controlled by which political factions. If you look at this map, it does look like the so-called Houthi movement. Again, that's often a derogatory name used by people criticizing the movement. The real name is Ansar Allah. And if you look at the map of the area that's governed by the government created by Ansar Allah, they're not the only political party, by the way, in the government that they've created. There are other political parties. But the point is that the dominant political force in northern Yemen is Ansar Allah. It looks on the map like they don't control that much of Yemeni territory. However, they control the territory where roughly 80% of the Yemeni population lives. Because if you look at this map of Yemen, it's a bit misleading because so much of the eastern part of Yemen is not populated. It consists largely of deserts. There are a few important cities, but in between those cities, there are almost no people living there, very few people living. So most of the population is concentrated toward the western part of the country, especially near the coast and especially in the north. So the so-called internationally recognized government of Yemen, based in the south, only governs about 20% of the population, a very small minority of the population. And it's very important to understand who exactly the so-called Houthis are, that is Ansar Allah, and where they came from. There's a Western media talking point that is often used, especially by supporters of the US and Israel, who claim that supposedly the Houthis are Iranian proxies, which is completely absurd. Actual academic experts like Helen Lackner, who's written many books about Yemen, she spent a lot of time in Yemen, speaks Arabic, has interviewed many people in the movement. She and other academic experts have emphasized that the so-called Houthis, Ansar Allah, are not Iranian proxies. They are political allies of Iran. They support Iran and the Islamic Revolution, but they're not proxies. They have their domestic origins in Yemeni society. And to understand Ansar Allah, we have to go back to 2014, when on the 21st of September, there was a revolution in the northern part of Yemen, where the majority of the population lives. And that revolution was largely led by Ansar Allah and its political allies. And again, some of those political allies include other Islamic-oriented parties, but also even some leftist parties, including Arab nationalist, Nasserist parties, and even a socialist party that have allied with Ansar Allah. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.